Don't forget to like, comment, share and subscribe, and do consider supporting the channel via PayPal or Patreon. You'll find the links in the video description. Going into round 9 of the Tata Steel Masters, 2 players shared the lead. Magnus Carlsen and Shakhriyar Mamedyarov, and as luck had it, they played in the 9th round. So here we go. The showdown between the two leaders. Carlsen had white, and it went into a Catalan. So this is Carlsen's favourite opening with white at the moment. He's using his World Championship preparation to good effect so far, at any rate. I don't think it's an opening that suits him, and he isn't playing it in the way that, say, Karpov and Anderson were playing it in the 1980s, which was to get a very small edge and to grind away, which, well, would often be Carlsen's style. But actually Magnus is playing really sharp lines, as we saw against Nepo, where he sacrificed a pawn very early on. And let's see what happens here. So Shak is also playing a pretty sharp line. Often black tries to hang on to that pawn on c4 in this line. And you might recall a famous game between Anand and Topalov from their World Championship match in 2010, where Vichy played Queen c2 here. And that also resulted in a really tense game where Toppy, wanted to hang on to that pawn. But Vichy won an absolutely beautiful game. Anyway, that's another story. So for the moment, Carlsen leaves that pawn on c4 and just continues with his development. And, well, I mean, the most popular move here is just Queen c2, which can lead to really sharp positions similar to that Anand Topalov game. But Carlsen just played e3 here. So he's strengthening the pawn chain. Means that sometimes he can play knight e5 and that pawn is defended by the pawn here. It's a solid move, and he might go for queen e2 sometimes. But anyway, he keeps his options open. This is a move that was played, well, it's a speciality of the Russian player Matlakov. And indeed, if knight c6 here, then queen e2 is a possibility. But, well, typical Mamedyarov, he played a really sharp move here. I mean, you can play c6 here, you can play knight d7. Knight d7 may be the most solid. You're not committing your pawns yet, and you might just defend the pawn like that. But Mamedyarov, after about a 10-minute think, played rook a6. So he takes the rook off the long diagonal, and that means he's preparing to advance with b5, and that's exactly what happened. So queen c2. So if Carlsen can simply snap off the c-pawn, then that's a very pleasant position. Then, well, it makes this rook move look a bit silly. So b5, this of course is the intention of rook a6, so that b5 is possible without allowing some hit on the long diagonal. Carlsen plays a4 to break up those queenside pawns. Of course, pawn takes pawn will be exactly what white wants. But c6, so that hangs on to the pawn on b5, which protects the pawn on c4. But that is a pretty ugly piece on a6. So can Carlsen exploit it? Knight c3. So a bit more pressure on that pawn. Now, if bishop takes, then pawn takes. Now, this is white's. White has the two bishops against bishop and knight. And it's that bishop on d2 which is soon going to come into the game. So if this pawn advances to e5 and that opens up this diagonal, opens up this diagonal for the bishop, that's really dangerous. In the meantime, that pawn can't advance here. So yeah, I think should be nice for white. So instead of taking on c3, Mamedyarov just played rook b6 to cover the pawn on b5. But somehow it doesn't look very attractive, and Carlsen simply advanced in the middle of the board, and now there is a clear attacking threat to play e5, pushing the knight out of the way, and then knight to g5, threatening mate on h7. And white's attack starts, and of course you can use the e4 square as well for perhaps a second knight, or perhaps the knight on g5. This is already, to my eyes, such a pleasant position for white. It's a beautiful initiative, and yeah, really not an easy position for black at all. So Mamedyarov, after about a 9-minute think, brought the bishop back to e7. At least that covers the g5 square, and now he decided to sack the exchange. Could come back with knight d7. Then white can use the e4 square. I mean, this is a beautiful position. Here, black doesn't even have a knight on d5. Let's say b4, because there was a threat to play bishop a5. Knight here, this is so typical. Threatening mate. So g6, queen e4, and the queen swings over to the king side, and then g4. I mean, white's attack kind of plays itself here. It's just a wonderful attacking position. And Mamedyarov, you know, he's the kind of player that loves the initiative himself, and he doesn't really enjoy finding himself in a passive position having to defend. So knight d5 instead, and this is actually an exchange sacrifice. Of course, that's the square where the knight wants to be anyway, in the middle. But watch what happens. Pawn takes pawn, pawn recaptures, and knight takes knight. If queen takes, that's not too bright, because mate is threatened and the queen is threatened. Whoops, queen is threatened like that. So pawn takes, but now white can take here. So Carlsen has won an exchange. Nevertheless, Mamedyarov certainly has some compensation here. These pawns are pleasant, and he's managed to get some piece activity. So he's kind of straightened out his pieces now. They look pretty good, and the pawns look pretty good. Nevertheless, it's a full exchange for white. Rook against bishop. Rook a8, nice move. That means if the bishop moves, then you can exchange rooks. And exchanging rooks, when you're the exchange up, is, I'm using that word a lot, is really desirable. So that just puts the pressure on. And there's a critical moment here where black could take the pawn on d4, but then white will take on d5, and white's pieces look pretty good here. But it's quite a sharp variation. This is good for white. Just for a moment it looks critical, but actually after queen e2, you know, these endgames are simply better for white. So Mamedyarov played h6, and Carlsen simply defended the rook. I mean, those rooks now look really powerful, very stable position. And bishop e6, just to protect that pawn. Queen d1. There's actually no need to exchange rooks here yet. b4. So this is a very important moment in the game, and here is where Carlsen plays an excellent move. And it rather reminds me of the King's Gambit. He played b3, which just stops those pawns in their tracks. And it's a difficult position because, of course, white threatens to take and then push on. So pawn takes pawn certainly doesn't look right. That just sort of breaks up those pawns. So c3 gives black a protected passed pawn. However, now white has stability. Now, what do I mean when I say it reminds me of the King's Gambit? Well, I'm going to go back to the beginning. Just a little digression. So, King's Gambit, g5, knight c3. It's a very typical position. And here, when I was looking at the King's Gambit again after many years for when I did a DVD for ChessBase a couple of years ago. I found that this move was scoring incredibly well for white. So obviously white just wants to destroy this pawn chain and try to break through. But of course black has g4 and then f3 to close the kingside and to get a protected passed pawn on f3. Well, we don't want to play the king and pawn endgames. However, before then, black has to survive the middle game. And in fact, as I noticed, white had fantastic results from this position. And you just play around these pawns. And in fact, it's very useful to have this diagonal open. So the queen comes here, castles queenside, and very soon white is actually able to use the f5 square. And white pieces just are able to enter into black's position. It's a wonderful position for white. So something similar happens here after c3, that actually white is able to use these squares very well. So first of all, rook a6 from Carlsen. It's interesting. He can now see that actually it's good to maintain his rooks. He doesn't need to exchange rooks now. Now he could play queen d3 here, but knight e1 I really like. Beautiful move. So the idea is to put the knight on c2, where it protects the pawn on d4. Now the diagonal is open, and it'll be possible, for example, to perhaps play the queen in, or it might be that the knight simply comes to e3 as well to put more pressure on the pawn on d5. So yeah, let's have a quick look. So g6, knight c2, and then knight e3 attacking d5 is a really attractive plan. And you can see that white has stability here once these pawns are blockaded. But after knight e1, Mamedyarov played f6. Well, I think he realises that he's getting squashed here. So, well, typically for him, he wants to try and stir up trouble. But now the knight goes to d3, and this is an excellent move, covering e5, but also looking at the f4 square. And he doesn't need to worry about knight takes d4 because rook takes and bishop takes, and this pin is decisive. If the knight is protected, then knight f4 is just winning, for example. So after knight d3, pawn takes, knight takes e5, knight takes, and rook takes e6. So this is absolutely horrible. White is breaking through here, and then the king is going to suffer. See all these weakened light squares. c2 played, and now a very calm move from Carlsen. He played queen e1, and here Mamedyarov resigned. So let's just have a look why. Remember, this knight is attacked. This pawn is attacked. And, well, the rook is threatening, in some cases, to take on e7 as well. So, for example, if knight d3, bishop takes d5. So watch out for a discovered check. So king h8. Rook takes e7 anyway. Of course, knight takes, and then rook takes queen. Queen d6, queen e3. Yes, black can get a queen, but it really doesn't help. And after this, for example, white is winning very, very easily, because this knight is, well, is it trapped? Not, maybe strictly speaking, not quite trapped. But anyway, white is 2 pawns up with a crushing position at the other end of the board. So that's where Mamedyarov resigned. Wow, what a convincing victory for Carlsen. He was asked after the game, well, you know, you seem to be winning games sort of, you know, relatively quickly. Well, here is move 27. He's also won, you know, a few other relatively quick games. You know, where are the slow grinds that we often see from Carlsen? He said, well, it's back to what was working well for me in 2019. it's going well. And that's a reference to what happened in 2019. I've mentioned this previously. After his match against Caruana, he kind of had a dividend because he had all this opening preparation that he managed to recycle and use for tournaments in 2019, and he was just crushing the opposition. And that seems to be what's happening here, with certainly the Catalan is a potent weapon for him with the white pieces at the moment. So after that very important victory, Carlsen takes the lead with 6.5 out of 9. In second place, Anish Giri with 6 out of 9, just half a point behind. He defeated Sam Shankland. So it looks like those two are doing very well. Let's just have a quick look at pairings for round 10. Carlsen has black against Karyakin. Giri has white against Duda. See you tomorrow.